First, we're going to talk about the Davy Crockett almanacs, which started to be published in 1835 in Nashville. Now, an almanac has things in it like astronomical calculations for farmers, so as to know when's the right time to set out certain crops and stuff like that. And that stuff was included in here, but the bulk of each issue was articles about life on the frontier and short stories about Davy Crockett, and later short stories about other frontier figures as well. Davy Crockett, of course, a famous frontiersman from Tennessee who got elected to Congress and became famous in large part because of his sort of backwoods, folksy, populist approach. He was a spinner of tall tales. In 1834, he had written his autobiography. And that same year was his last year in Congress because he lost his last reelection campaign in November of 34 and then moved to Texas, where he was killed at the Alamo in 1836. So as you can see, these almanacs started coming out after his autobiography, which was, a very popular national bestseller of the time, and before he got even more famous by getting killed at the Alamo. Initially published and printed in Nashville, later on in other cities. Crockett himself had nothing to do with this journal. He didn't write anything in it, and so far as I know, he didn't get any money from it. Wouldn't have had the chance to, really, because only a few issues came out before he got killed. But it did expand on his legend, and it became popular enough that it was still being published 20 years after Crockett's death. The fictionalized stories about Davy Crockett were greatly exaggerated, sort of in the tradition of frontier stories, and in fact to the point that the character, not the real person, but the character in the stories, had basically superhuman powers. In fact, in one of the earliest, I think it was the first issue, an introduction was written, allegedly by Davy Crockett. He didn't actually write it, but this writer pretending to be David Crockett was talking about how I'm going to take the readers on a journey through the frontier, and quote, and as a matter of fact, I will convince them that I can run faster, jump higher, squat lower, dive deeper, stay under longer, and come up drier than any man in the whole county. And indeed, those are the kind of feats that the heroic Davy Crockett character was able to carry out. Now, over time, the stories started to develop certain qualities. There was a lot of scatological jokes, poop jokes, and there was kind of some very risque material for the time, for the 1830s and 1840s. A lot of times these stories would have Davy Crockett out in the woods, and he would encounter wild women, half panther women, half bear women. One occasion, he somehow managed to get his head stuck in the crotch of a tree, and this beautiful woman came along and straddled him while she worked his head loose, and he was able to stare up her dress, and he convinced her to go home and, quote, bundle with him. So a little bit maybe surprisingly sexual for the time period. And these stories, like I said, they were very popular. They were around for a long time. But what does this have to do, you may ask, with comic books? Well, for one thing, it's subject matter, right? These are adventure stories about heroes with virtually superhuman powers, but also a lot of the reason we're talking about it is the targeted audience. That targeted audience, of course, was adolescent boys, maybe late pre-adolescent, all the way up to young men into their late 20s and, or, I'm sorry, their late teens and early 20s. Timing, they say, is everything. And the timing of these stories is very important because there was something going on, something really big going on in the United States. The market revolution, which started roughly around 1815 at the end of the War of 1812 and had the biggest impact from around 1820 through the 1840s. It was actually part of the larger European Industrial Revolution, which had started obviously over in Europe, a little bit late getting to the U.S., but in the U.S. that sort of expanded, and because it was accompanied by a transportation and communication revolution in this really large country, it led to, well, a much bigger emphasis on markets. And that may sound kind of boring, but the fact is that this huge change led to some really fundamental changes in how many people lived and even how they thought in the United States. And the same thing, like I said, was going on in Europe in a slightly different way. So what this means is that as more people during this time period, especially more young people, are leaving the farm, right, because the vast, vast majority of Americans had heretofore been small family farmers, subsistence farmers, but as more and more young people are going to the cities, especially in the East, to work in factories or to work in shops and offices, then you've got a situation where young men who, if they had stayed on the farm, probably would have gotten married when they were, 18, 19 years old, to 15, 16-year-old neighbor girl, and maybe gotten some land from dad, or made a land claim a short distance away, and gotten started with the whole farming venture. But now more of these young men are living in the city, and they're working either in factories, or they're working as clerks, or they're working in offices, and they're not able to get married until later in life because they can't afford it. And it's a pretty quick change, a pretty quick cultural change. And those people who were sort of stuck in the middle on that could find themselves being very, very frustrated with sort of the 9 to 5 grind, which was a relatively new phenomenon everywhere, really. All of a sudden there are schedules to keep and trains to catch. No longer do you go out, after the sun comes up and work till the sun goes down. But now you've got all these other considerations, and people started to feel like cogs in a machine. And the more that they felt like that, the more, particularly young men, were yearning for freedom, for independence. And stories about people like Davy Crockett, or like the famous river pirate Mike Fink, living out on the edge of, quote, civilization, out there on the frontier and doing basically whatever they wanted, was very, very attractive. Now, if a young man was serious about this, he could just pick up and move out to the frontier, and some did, but most didn't. Most weren't that serious about it, but they could at least read about it. They could read about it and fantasize about it, and they could live vicariously through Davy Crockett and the Davy Crockett almanacs, and then later other types of frontier individuals, like for example Daniel Boone, who was from the generation before Davy Crockett. He had actually become famous in the 1770s and had died around 1820, a very old man. And there had been a lot written about him in his lifetime. There had been serious biographies written of him. But around the same time these Davy Crockett almanacs were coming out, you started seeing books about Daniel Boone that also had these just really unbelievable exaggerations and tall tales, presenting him almost like a supernatural figure bent on opening the West. And around the same time, it is not a coincidence that the first really successful American novelist came on the scene, James Fenimore Cooper. And he wrote his Leatherstocking Tales, which was a cycle of 5 novels that included The Last of the Mohicans. And those were set back in the 1700s during the French and Indian War, and then later. But they were published between 1823 is when the first one came out, and 1840 is when the last one came out. And they centered on a frontiersman named Hawkeye, or Nathaniel Bumppo. So these types of highly romanticized frontier figures were extremely popular with American audiences, but particularly with adolescent boys and young men. By the way, just as a side point, a lot of people get Davy Crockett and Daniel Boone mixed up, which not surprising considering that they were sort of at their frontier popularity in the 19th century in the 1830s and 40s, even though they lived in different times. But I think part of it may have had something to do with the fact that the actor Fess Parker played both of them on separate TV shows in the 1950s and 60s. Now, the Leatherstocking Tales were considered high literature. They were considered to be classy stuff. The Davy Crockett stories on the cheap pulp paper, on the other hand, were considered to be crap by middle-class people, by middle-aged people in the East, right? And there was a lot of concern that young men, boys and young men, were reading this crap. That'll rot your mind, that garbage. Why don't you stop fantasizing about adventures and get to work? And right in the middle of all this came the invention in 1843 of the steam-powered rotary printing press. And there's an illustration of one. It was a large operation, which was a press that was able to produce millions of copies of a single page each day. Now, that's revolutionary, and it is going to be particularly revolutionary for the sort of things we're talking about here, because when you can make way, way, way more of something, the price goes down, right? Because it's supply and demand, there's a much bigger supply. So prices go down. That makes it more affordable. And we're talking about periodicals. So prices go down, it becomes more affordable. That means that adolescents and young adults are more readily able to acquire these periodicals. And this led to the introduction in England of cheap tabloid periodicals aimed at young working class men and adolescent boys that could be sold for a penny. So these were essentially in format like a newspaper. right? Really cheap pulp paper, combined with the high production rate of that printing press, made these things available. They were called story papers or boys' weeklies, tales of adventure and the macabre. Um, Quickly started to be referred to in a disdainful way by grown ups as penny dreadfuls. One very famous example of the type of lurid and sensationalistic story that would appear in Penny Dreadfuls was this one: Sweeney Todd, the Demon Barber of Fleet Street, which first appeared in serialized form in Penny Dreadfuls in the 1840s. What's a little cannibalism among friends and barbers? It was in the United States that this type of literature sort of moved up to the next level in 1860 with the introduction of Beadle's dime novels, Beadle being the publishing company, and dime novels being short novels that you could buy for a dime. There were some line illustrations, although not a whole lot. It was mostly text, and it mostly was that same sort of literature, sort of focused on adventure and mystery, sometimes focused on frontier settings, and so forth. Dime novels were small books. They were about the same size as modern day mass market paperback, roughly the same dimensions. So you can see that there. Although this book, not a dime novel, this book cost $8 when it came out a few years ago. This has 250 pages. A typical dime novel had about 100 pages, so about that much, right? So this is what you were looking at. It didn't have the cardboard cover or the full color cover. It was a much cheaper operation, as you would imagine, for a dime, although that was 150 years ago. I showed you a Western paperback novel sort of as comparison, and that's sort of appropriate because dime novels from the 1860s on throughout the end of the 19th century, many of them, maybe even the majority of them, had Western frontier themes. And dime novel authors like Ned Buntline took real life people from the West, like Buffalo Bill Cody and Wild Bill Hickok and Calamity Jane and others, and made them into international celebrities by their extremely exaggerated and almost entirely fictionalized accounts of the exploits of these individuals. Detective mysteries were also a very popular genre for dime novels, as indicated here, with magazines like the New York Detective Library, Secret Service, and Old Sleuth, the Dutch Detective. The next step in this story evolution came in the United States around the turn of the century, circa 1900, starting in the late 1890s. The birth of pulp magazines or pulp fiction. These these magazines were very similar to dime novels in content and presentation. They were made on really cheap newsprint type paper, pulp paper. That's where they got their name. And they weren't folded up like newspapers. They were magazines, but they had ragged, untrimmed edges. Unlike dime novels, they could be some of them as long as 200 pages, which is a heck of a magazine, right? And they had color covers, slick color covers that were often very colorful and caught the eye. And all this for 10 cents initially, and then later 15 cents, so that dime novels fell out of popularity. It was difficult for them to compete with pulp magazines for affordability and for content eventually. So you had magazines like Argosy magazine in 1906. In 1912, there was a magazine established called The All Story. And that's another thing that makes these different from dime novels. It is not one long novella like dime novels were by the same author. That's the same story, but rather you would have several different authors with several short stories. For other popular titles that are sometimes called the Big Four, you had the Popular Magazine, 1903, Adventure, 1910, Blue Book, 1905, which is one of the ones that lasted the longest. It lasted all the way until 1975. Most of these things folded after World War II when the mass market paperback was introduced. And short stories, that was one of the first ones, and it lasted longer than most of the others until 1959. Some writers, characters, and stories introduced originally in pulp magazines would go on to have a lot of success in other media and become, in some cases, large parts of American popular culture. And certainly, Edgar Rice Burroughs fits into that category. His works, his earliest works in the 19 teens, were first published in pulp magazines, usually the All Story, and that's stories like Tarzan of the Apes, John Carter of Mars, both from 1912, and in 1918, The Land That Time Forgot, which is very similar to an earlier story by Sherlock Holmes creator Arthur Conan Doyle from 1912, The Lost World. Jurassic Park owes a lot to both of those stories. So Edgar Rice Burroughs, like I said, he became successful enough eventually when his stories were recollected as novels, and then when he sold the movie rights and so forth, that he invested in the building of a small town in California named Tarzana. Well, technically, I guess it's more of a neighborhood than a town. It's a neighborhood in Los Angeles that was sort of built up around what had originally been a ranch that Edgar Rice Burroughs had bought. So even in the 1920s, buying a ranch right on the edge of Los Angeles took some money. By the way, I'm sure I don't have to tell you that those Edgar Rice Burroughs properties I just mentioned would all also eventually be comic books. Also debuting in All Story in the 19 teens, El Zorro, the fox, so cunning and free. First appeared in a short story called The Curse of Capistrano in 1919, and just 1 year later made his debut on film in the silent movie version of The Mark of Zorro, starring Douglas Fairbanks. Got his start in Pulp Fiction. And yes, you guessed it. Also, take note, El Zorro is a masked adventurer with a secret identity. And finally, just as with dime novels, detective mysteries were also a very popular genre in pulp fiction. Probably the two most famous mystery-centric pulp magazines were Smith and Street's Detective Stories magazine in 1915 and The Black Mask in 1920, which was co-founded and published by the famous author H.L. Mencken. And The Black Mask in particular would feature writers that, like Edgar Rice Burroughs, would go on to have large impacts on other media and on popular culture, especially on the mystery genre in general, including writers such as Raymond Chandler, John D. MacDonald, Earl Stanley Gardner, who created Perry Mason, and Dashiell Hammett, whose stories, including The Maltese Falcon, first appeared in the pages of Black Mask. All right then, so to summarize so far, we've looked at the history of sequential art, and we've now looked at the history of cheap, sensationalized adventure stories geared toward adolescents. Next, we will look at the birth of the comic strip in the 1890s, and we'll go into some detail about that. Then we'll talk a little bit about radio dramas and radio heroes like The Shadow, The Green Hornet, The Lone Ranger. And finally, we will get to the point in the mid-1930s when all of these elements sort of come together to create an original American art form.